They took the silver first, then the good china, then the porch swing her husband built with his own 2 hands. "That old book's trash, Lorraine," her daughter-in-law said, and put it on the burn pile. 6 weeks later, a bank officer opened its final page. The room went quiet. Let me take you back to the funeral. Lorraine Pruitt was 74 years old. She had been a widow for 11 days. She stood on the porch of the house she'd lived in for 49 years. She watched Tiffany Pruitt carry her wedding china out to a rented van. The boxes said kitchen in thick black marker. "That old book's trash, Lorraine," Tiffany said. She didn't look up from the silver. She was wrapping it in Lorraine's own dish towels. "I already put it on the burn pile." Lorraine didn't answer. She never raised her voice. 49 years married to Walter Pruitt had taught her something simple. The loudest person in a room usually had the least to say. She walked past Tiffany. She went down the porch steps. She walked out to the burn barrel at the edge of the yard. 3 days of trash sat there waiting for a match. On top of a broken lamp and a stack of wet cardboard sat Walter's ledger. The brown leather was cracked down the spine. 50 years of farm accounts lived inside it. Feed bills. The price of hay in a dry summer. Written in a hand so small you needed good light to read it. Tiffany had called it scribbles. Derek, Lorraine's own son, had called it clutter. Nobody had asked Lorraine what she thought. Nobody ever did anymore. She lifted it out with both hands. She carried it back inside like something baptized. Every morning since Walter died, Lorraine set out 2 coffee cups. She'd pour his black, no sugar, the way he liked it. She let it sit there going cold while she drank her own. She didn't know why she did it. She just did. She dusted the ledger on its shelf every Sunday, same as she'd done for 30 years. Whether Walter noticed or not. He always noticed. He'd smile at her over his newspaper and say nothing. Walter Pruitt believed most things worth saying could be said with a look. That was the kind of woman Lorraine was, the kind who kept a shelf dusted for a dead man's ledger while her son's wife hauled off the good china in a rented van. The kind of quiet people mistake for weakness. Right up until the day it isn't. Linden Hollow, West Virginia, sat in a fold of the Blue Ridge. The road narrowed to gravel out there. The last streetlight was 2 miles back. Everybody in town still called the Pruitt place the Pruitt place, even though it hadn't belonged to a Pruitt man in 11 days. There was one bank in Linden Hollow. Linden Hollow, Savings and Trust. One teller window. A clock on the wall that ran 4 minutes slow. A loan officer named Halloran had worked there since before Lorraine's own children were born. Walter used to say a strange thing every so often. Usually in the fall, when the ledger came out to settle the year's accounts, he'd tap the last column with one thick finger. "Count the rows, Laurie," he'd say. "I never trusted the bank with the last column." She never knew what he meant by it. She'd asked him once, early in their marriage. He'd just smiled that same smile and turned the page. She'd stopped asking after a while. Some questions you let a marriage answer slowly, over decades, instead of all at once. Derek had married Tiffany 9 years ago. The ceremony was at a golf club 40 miles away. It cost more than Walter made in half a year of tobacco. Lorraine had smiled through the whole thing. She'd hugged Tiffany at the reception. She told her, honestly, that she was glad Derek had found somebody who made him laugh. She meant it. She still meant it, mostly. Even now, watching Tiffany fold her linens into a box like they were spoils of war. "We'll need the house on the market by spring," Tiffany was saying. To nobody in particular. Maybe to herself. Maybe loud enough for Lorraine to hear on purpose. "Derek says the lake house won't wait forever. We already put a deposit down. The realtor thinks it'll list for $220,000. Easy." A deposit. On a lake house. 11 days after the funeral. Lorraine stood in the kitchen doorway with the ledger against her chest. She said nothing. She'd learned, over 49 years, that silence was a kind of armour. People filled silence with their own guilt, if you let them. Tiffany didn't fill it with guilt. She filled it with a phone call to a realtor, right there in the kitchen. She gave the address like it was already sold. That evening, the van pulled away. It was loaded with everything that had ever made the house feel like a house. Lorraine sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her. The pages smelled like dust and pipe tobacco. Walter hadn't smoked a pipe in 15 years. Old habits stay in leather longer than they stay in a man. She ran her thumb along the inside back cover. Out of habit. The way you touch a photograph you've touched 1,000 times. This time, the end paper gave. Not much. Just a little lift at the corner. The glue had dried and cracked with age. She pressed on it. It lifted more. Underneath, flat against the board, was something small and metal and cold. A brass key. Beside it, folded into quarters so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, was a slip of paper. A string of numbers, in Walter's tiny, careful hand. Lorraine sat very still. Outside, an owl called from the tree line. Somewhere down the gravel road a dog barked twice and stopped. She thought about Walter tapping that last column with his thick finger. Count the rows, Laurie. She didn't know yet what the key opened. She didn't know that in 6 weeks she'd be standing at the counter of Linden Hollow Savings and Trust. A room full of people would be there. People who thought they already knew how this story ended. They'd watch it end a different way, entirely. She only knew sitting there with a dead man's key in her palm that Walter Pruitt had never once done anything in his life without a reason. She put the key in her cardigan pocket. She closed the ledger. She went to bed. Tomorrow she'd go to the bank. Tomorrow she'd find out what Walter Pruitt had never trusted them to know. Lorraine had married Walter in the spring of 1975. Same little Methodist church where they'd later bury him. She was 25. He was 28, already farming 40 acres. His own father had scraped it together from 3 failed neighbours during the Depression. Nobody else had wanted that land. It was the kind of dirt that broke ploughs and hearts in equal measure. Walter made it work through sheer patient stubbornness. The same stubbornness that made him load hay bales at 60 with a bad hip, rather than hire it out. The same stubbornness that kept that ledger balanced to the penny for 50 straight years. Even after banks started doing it all on computers, Derek was born in 78. A daughter, Carol, followed 2 years after. She moved to Ohio for a nursing job. She rarely called. When she did call, she asked after her mother first and the estate second. That was more than Lorraine could say for Derek these days. Derek had been a good boy once, quiet like his father, quick with his hands. He could fix an engine by the sound of it alone. Then he married Tiffany. Something in him went soft, in a direction Lorraine didn't have a word for except maybe embarrassed. Embarrassed of the farm, embarrassed of the ledger. Embarrassed, she sometimes thought, of her. Mum, nobody keeps books by hand anymore, he'd told her once. Not unkindly, more like he was explaining something to a child. It's not worth anything. It's just Dad being Dad. Just Dad being Dad. As if 50 years of a man's quiet discipline could be folded up that small and set on a burn pile. The morning after she found the key, Lorraine put on her good coat. The forest teal cardigan Walter always said matched her eyes. She walked the half-mile into town. Nobody was going to offer her a ride, so she didn't wait for one. She passed the old feed store, closed now. She passed the diner where she and Walter used to split a slice of pie on Fridays. She came at last to the brick front of Linden Hollow Savings and Trust. The clock in the window still ran 4 minutes slow. Same as it had her whole life. Halloran was behind the counter. Same as always. A heavy-set man in his 70s, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He had a way of looking at you like he already knew your business before you said a word. He'd known Walter for 40 years. He'd co-signed the loan on the tractor in 81. He was the only man in town who might know what Walter Pruitt had never trusted to a ledger anyone else could read. "Lorraine," he said. Something in his face changed the moment he saw the ledger under her arm. "I wondered when you'd bring that in." "You wondered right," Lorraine said. She set the ledger on the counter between them. Careful, the way you'd set down something that still had heat in it. Tiffany put it on the burn pile. I took it back out. Halloran didn't laugh, though a smaller man might have. He just nodded, slow, and pulled his glasses down off his forehead. Your Walter came in here in 1989, he said. Rented a safe deposit box. Paid it up for 50 years in advance, cash, $18 a year. Nobody does that. Told me if anything ever happened to him, not to say a word about it to anybody but you. Not Derek. Not the lawyer. You. Lorraine felt something tighten behind her sternum. Half grief, half something she didn't yet have a name for. 50 years, she said. He'd have been over 100. He said he was a patient man. Halloran almost smiled, said the bank might not be here in 50 years, but the paper would be, one way or another. She took the brass key out of her cardigan pocket. She set it on the counter beside the ledger. Halloran looked at it a long moment. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out a ledger of his own. A newer one, spiral-bound. He ran his finger down a column of box numbers written in blue ink. Box 141, he said. I remember it because it's the only one in this bank that's never once been opened since it was rented. 36 years. He looked up at her. You want to do this now? Or sit with it a while first? Lorraine thought about Tiffany's realtor call in the kitchen. The Lake House deposit. Derek's voice on the phone that morning, tired and distant. We need to talk about the house soon, Mum, before things get complicated. She thought about 49 years of 2 coffee cups every morning. One of them always going cold. Now, she said, I've waited long enough for one lifetime. The vault at Linden Hollow Savings and Trust was smaller than most people imagined. A back room, a heavy round door left open during business hours, a wall of steel boxes, each no bigger than a shoebox. Halloran walked her back himself. He used his own key alongside hers to turn the 2 locks together. He slid box 141 free of the wall. It was heavier than it looked. Lorraine set it on the little table in the centre of the room. She lifted the lid with both hands, the same way she'd lifted the ledger off the burn pile. Something being baptised twice. Inside was a second ledger, smaller than the first, bound in the same cracked brown leather. On its cover, in Walter's tiny, careful hand, one line, for the one who stayed. Lorraine sat down hard in the folding chair Halloran pulled out for her. She didn't open it right away. She just looked at those 5 words. 49 years compressed themselves into a sentence her husband had written and never once said aloud. You all right? Halloran asked. I don't know yet, she said honestly. She opened it. The pages inside weren't feed bills or hay prices. They were savings bond certificates. Dozens of them, dated back across 3 decades. Each one purchased small, $25 here, $50 there. The kind of amount a farmer could skim off a good harvest without anybody at home noticing the difference. Behind the bonds was a single folded document. Thick paper, official, a county seal pressed into the corner. Halloran read over her shoulder because she asked him to. Her own eyes had gone blurry, and she didn't trust them anymore. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, in the voice of a man who did not often say things twice, Lorraine, this is a deed. To the house, she said. Not a question. To the house, the 40 acres, and the mineral rights under it. He turned the page. He checked the recording stamp. He checked it again. Recorded 11 years ago. In your name only. Not Walter's. Not Derek's. Yours. The room was very quiet. Somewhere above them, through the floor, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the bank. A printer, a phone ringing twice and stopping, someone's boots on the tile. Down here in a room built to hold things people were afraid to lose, Lorraine Pruitt sat holding proof. Her husband had spent 11 years quietly making sure nobody could ever take from her what he built. He never told me, she said. He didn't tell me the whole of it either, Halloran said. Just told me to keep it safe. Let you come to it in your own time. He closed the box lid gently. Man like Walter, he didn't believe in giving somebody a gift and then standing around waiting to be thanked for it. Lorraine thought of the Enigma line again, the way he'd tap the ledger's last column every fall. Count the rows, Laurie. I never trusted the bank with the last column. She understood it now, or thought she did. He hadn't meant the bank couldn't be trusted with money. He'd meant something bigger. He didn't trust anyone, bank or family, to safeguard the truth of what he'd built for her, except the 2 of them. And now, this quiet man behind the counter, who'd kept a secret for 36 years, without once breaking it. She didn't tell Derek that first night. She wasn't sure yet what she was protecting, or from whom, though some old and patient part of her already suspected the answer. She went home to a house 3/4 empty of the things Tiffany had already carried off. She sat at the kitchen table and read the second ledger by lamplight, well past midnight, learning her husband all over again, one small entry at a time. There was a woman 2 farms over, Edith Calloway, 71 years old, widowed 9 years herself. She'd taken to bringing Lorraine a casserole every few days since the funeral. Never asked, never staying long enough to be thanked properly. She showed up the morning after the vault, unannounced, foil-covered dish in hand, a look on her face like she already knew something was different. "You look like a woman who slept for the first time in 2 weeks," Edith said, setting the dish on the counter. "I found something," Lorraine said and told her. "Not all of it." "Enough." Edith didn't gasp. She didn't clap her hands. She just nodded slowly, the way you nod at weather you'd half expected. "Walter Pruitt," she said, "was the only man in this county who ever balanced his checkbook to the penny for 50 straight years, and never once told anybody how much was actually in it." She squeezed Lorraine's hand. "Don't you let that girl talk you out of what's rightfully yours, you hear me? Not for 1 minute." "I don't intend to," Lorraine said. Saying it, she was a little surprised to find she meant it. That evening an envelope showed up in her mailbox. No return address, just her name, in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside, $40 in worn bills and a note in shaky, unpracticed cursive. "Saw the van outside your house last week. Whatever they took, it wasn't the important thing. Someone in this town remembers what your husband did for the Hendersons when the bank would have foreclosed on them in '92. We don't forget." Lorraine read it twice. She folded it into the second ledger like a bookmark. She did not cry, though she came close. She still hadn't decided what she'd do with any of it. But something in her had shifted, quiet as a key turning in an old lock, and it was not going to shift back. Word travelled fast in a town as small as Linden Hollow. By the following Sunday, half the congregation at the little Methodist church seemed to know Lorraine Pruitt had found something in her husband's old ledger. Nobody knew quite what. The guessing filled the church parking lot with more energy than the sermon itself had managed in weeks. Pastor Whitfield, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who'd buried Walter, not 3 weeks before, caught Lorraine by the arm on her way to her truck. "I hear there's been some excitement out at your place," he said. "Careful, the way pastors learn to be careful about grief and money in the same breath. I hope none of it's added to your burden." "Quite the opposite, Pastor," Lorraine said, "though I'd rather not say more until the lawyers have their say. Of course. Of course." He patted her hand. "Walter was a good man. Quiet, but good. I always suspected there was more to him than that ledger of his let on. You and half this county, it seems," Lorraine said. She drove home smiling for the first time that whole difficult week. At home, the mail had brought one more small surprise. A card from a family she barely remembered. The Doyles. They'd rented a small tenant house on the far edge of Walter's property for 2 years, back in the early 2000s, before moving on to steadier work in Roanoke. The card was simple, a printed spring bouquet. Inside, in handwriting gone slightly unsteady with age, a short note. "We heard about Walter passing. He let us stay 2 winters rent-free when the mill closed and we had nowhere else to go. Never told a soul. And neither did we, out of respect for how private he was about it. Wanted you to know, now that he's gone, just how much that quiet kindness meant to a family that had nothing to offer back." Lorraine read it twice at the kitchen table, then a third time. Her husband kept growing larger in her understanding with every week that passed, every stranger who came forward, every small unclaimed act of decency finally finding its way home to be counted. She started keeping the notes in a shoebox, on the same shelf as the 2 ledgers. A third record, and a growing one, of a man who had spent 50 years building something far bigger than a farm, one private mercy at a time. He never kept score anywhere but in his own quiet conscience, and in the careful books he trusted only her to eventually read. She set the Doyle's card into the shoebox, beside 2 others that had arrived that same week. Grief was turning out to be a strange kind of arithmetic. Every loss she added up seemed matched almost exactly by some new proof of how much larger her husband's quiet life had actually been. Larger than either of them had ever let on to the other. Even after 49 years sharing the same small house, the same small town, the same careful, patient silence, it had turned out, in the end, to be the loudest kind of love either of them had ever known how to give. Derek called on a Thursday morning. The way he always did now, quick and a little rushed, like the conversation was an errand he wanted crossed off before lunch. "Mum, we need to talk about the house," he said. "Tiffany's got a realtor lined up. Guy named Pruitt, no relation, funny enough. He thinks we could list by the 15th if we move some things along." "Move what things along?" Lorraine said. "The title search." A pause. He was choosing words that wouldn't sound as bad out loud as they did in his head. Tiffany looked into it. Dad never actually finished the paperwork transferring the house into a family trust, so it's just going to probate like normal. Once probate clears, it splits between me and Carol, same as everything else. You'll still have somewhere to live, Mum. Don't worry about that part. We just need to get moving. Lorraine sat with the phone against her ear. She looked at the second ledger, open on the kitchen table. At the deed with its county seal. At the line in her husband's hand. For the one who stayed. Derek, she said, when did Tiffany look into the house paperwork? Another pause, longer this time. I don't know, Mum. Does it matter? A few weeks ago, maybe. Before the funeral, even. She's just trying to help us get organised, that's all. Before the funeral. Lorraine turned that over slowly, the way you turn over a strange word in a crossword, testing it from different angles. Tiffany had been asking about the house's ownership before Walter was even in the ground. That wasn't organising, that was counting. I appreciate you calling, Lorraine said, which was true, and left it at that. Which was also, for the first time in a long while, entirely on purpose. She hung up and sat a long time with her hand flat on the ledger's cover, feeling the cracked leather under her palm. Then she called Halloran. I need you to check something for me, she said. Quietly. He didn't ask why. That was the kind of man he was. 2 days later he called her back. His voice was lower than usual. Careful. The voice of a man handing someone a piece of glass. Lorraine, he said, your daughter-in-law opened a line of credit application at the bank in Milton 3 weeks before Walter passed. Used the Pruitt address as collateral. It got denied on account of the title complications, which I'm guessing is the real reason she's in such a hurry to clear probate. Lorraine closed her eyes. So that was the shape of it. Not grief moving fast, debt moving fast, wearing grief's clothes. She's already put down on a lake house, Lorraine said quietly. Derek told me. Before winter, he said. Then she's leveraged herself against a sale that hasn't happened yet. Halloran's voice had gone flat and careful, the tone of a man laying facts on a table one at a time. No drama in it, because facts didn't need drama to matter. If this house doesn't sell, and sell soon, somebody's holding a debt with nothing behind it. Lorraine thought about the burn pile, the ledger sitting on top of a broken lamp, 1 page turn, away from ash. She thought too about the note in her mailbox, unsigned, about the Hendersons and the foreclosure. Walter had quietly stopped in 1992, a story she'd never once heard him tell. Not to her, not to anyone apparently, except whoever had written that note. Halloran, she said, who were the Hendersons? He was quiet a moment. Tom Henderson ran the feed store, back when there was one. Bank was fixing to take the building over a missed note in the spring of $9,000, give or take. Somebody paid it off anonymous through a lawyer in Charleston, no name attached. Tom always wondered, never found out. A pause. I'm starting to wonder myself now. Lorraine looked down at the second ledger's bond certificates. $25 here, $50 there, decade after decade. She understood slowly that Walter Pruitt had been quietly saving other people's futures, the same patient way he'd saved hers. A man who bought a 50-year safe deposit box in cash and told no one why. A man who tapped a column and said, count the rows, and meant something far larger than money. She didn't confront Tiffany. Not yet. She'd learned, over 49 years, that the loudest reaction wasn't always the truest one. Some moves you only get to make once, so you make them when the ground is fully beneath you, not a second before. Instead, she went to see a lawyer in the county seat, a young woman named Priya Nagpal, who'd handled Walter's small estate matters before. She laid the deed and the second ledger on the desk between them. Nagpal read the deed twice. She checked the recording stamp against the county's online registry on her computer. She looked up with an expression Lorraine had learned to recognise over the last 6 weeks. The look people got when the ground shifted under a story they thought they already knew. Mrs. Pruitt, Nagpal said, this deed was properly recorded 11 years ago. It supersedes anything that happens in probate on the rest of the estate, because the house was never part of the estate to begin with. Legally, it's been yours, solely yours, since 2015. She sat back. Does your son know? Not yet, Lorraine said. Does his wife? I don't think so. I think she assumes it's still in Walter's name. going through probate like everything else. Lorraine folded her hands in her lap, the posture of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning to sit quietly through storms that weren't hers to start. She's already spent money against a sale that can't happen. A deposit on a lake house. Nagpal was quiet a moment, tapping her pen against the desk. There's a hearing in 6 weeks, she said finally. Probate court, to settle the rest of Walter's estate. The farm equipment, the accounts, whatever's left after the house is excluded. Your son and his wife will both be there. If you want, we can raise the deed's existence formally at that hearing. On the record, in front of everyone who has an interest in this outcome. 6 weeks. Lorraine thought about the calendar, about Tiffany's realtor circling the 15th in red pen, about a lake house deposit already spent against a sale that legally could never happen. 6 weeks felt, all at once, like both a very long time and no time at all. Do it, she said, in front of everyone. That night she sat at the kitchen table with both ledgers open in front of her, the old one and the new one, side by side. For the first time since Walter died, she felt something other than grief sitting in the chair across from her. She felt faintly like she had company. Tiffany Pruitt had not always been a woman who counted other people's money. She'd grown up 2 counties over, a family with more appearances than assets. Her father drove a leased luxury car he could never quite afford. Her mother filled every silence with talk of how things ought to look. Tiffany learned early that looking successful and being successful were 2 entirely different kinds of arithmetic. She'd spent her whole adult life trying to make the first one true. Badly enough that she'd stopped noticing the second one wasn't. She married Derek at 26. Genuinely fond of him. Genuinely charmed by his quiet competence with his hands, the way he could fix anything mechanical without a manual, the way he never once raised his voice, even when frustrated. What she hadn't accounted for was how little that competence would translate into money in a county like Linden Hollow. A good mechanic made a living wage, and nothing more. That gap ate at her over 9 years, watching her college friends post vacation photos from places she and Derek could never afford. The lake house had been her idea from the start. A rustic 4-bedroom on Summers Lake, 40 minutes from Linden Hollow. Listed at $310,000, with a dock and a boat slip. Exactly the kind of backdrop Tiffany had spent years quietly craving, without ever admitting it to herself in those terms. She'd put $12,000 down before Walter's funeral was even scheduled. A bridge loan, structured by her own financial advisor, against the expected inheritance from the Pruitt estate. She'd used that term so casually in the meeting that she hadn't even registered how presumptuous it sounded. Not until months later, sitting in a courtroom, hearing it read back to her from a bank record. By the time of Walter's funeral, she was $41,000 in personal debt, 2 credit cards and the bridge loan. A number she'd told no one, not even Derek. She believed, the way people in trouble often do, that the problem would simply solve itself once the larger money arrived. The house would sell. The estate would settle. The debt would vanish into a much larger sum. The way a stone vanishes into a lake. Nobody would ever need to know how close to the surface she'd actually been swimming. Lorraine's ledger, sitting untouched on a hallway shelf while an old woman grieved, had looked to Tiffany like exactly nothing. A relic, an obstacle to a clean and profitable sale. The kind of sentimental clutter families always fought over pointlessly before agreeing, eventually, to let the professionals handle it. She genuinely believed, throwing it toward the burn pile, that she was doing everyone a favour, clearing the emotional debris before it slowed anything down. She hadn't imagined, not for 1 second, that the debris might be load-bearing. The conservatorship idea came from her financial advisor, actually, a man named Grant Voss, who specialised in estate acceleration strategies for families in complicated inheritance situations. That phrase meant, functionally, finding legal ways to speed cash toward people who needed it faster than the natural process allowed. Voss had suggested it gently, over a lunch Tiffany never mentioned to Derek. If Lorraine's mental competence could be reasonably questioned, even temporarily, a conservatorship might let the estate's more liquid decisions proceed, including the house sale, without waiting on an elderly widow's grief-slowed timeline. It had sounded in that lunch like efficiency. It had sounded, 6 weeks later, in a courtroom, like exactly what it was. Derek had gone along with pieces of it, the way he went along with most of Tiffany's plans these days. Not because he believed in them fully, because disagreeing took an energy he'd stopped budgeting for somewhere around year 6 of the marriage. He loved his mother. He'd never once actually believed she was confused, but he'd let the words sit in the air between them, unchallenged, because challenging it meant admitting how much of his own life he'd handed over to someone else's arithmetic. That admission felt, most days, harder than staying quiet. It was only in the weeks after the funeral that things changed. He watched his mother move through the world with a steadiness that looked less like fog and more like focus. The crack Lorraine had noticed at the kitchen table began to widen inside him. He started noticing things he'd trained himself not to notice. The way Tiffany's phone conversations went quiet whenever he walked into the room. The way she'd started referring to the lake house as already theirs in casual conversation with friends. The way she'd stopped asking how his mother was doing and started asking only when the estate would clear. He said nothing about any of it for a long while. That was the shape of the coward he'd let himself become. Lorraine had said to him once gently. It had stung precisely because it was true. His own father, watching from wherever fathers watch from, would have recognized the shape of it instantly. A man who kept quiet not out of peace, but out of fear, mistaking the two for each other. The same easy way Tiffany mistook looking successful for being it. Money, in the end, is rarely the actual wound in a family. It's only ever the excuse the real wound wears to get into the room. Tiffany's real wound was a childhood spent watching her parents perform a wealth they didn't have. Derek's real wound was a lifetime of being the quiet, competent second choice to whatever louder thing was happening in front of him. And Lorraine's wound was the oldest of the three. Nobody had bothered to ask about it. A lifetime of being the woman who kept the peace so well that everyone stopped wondering what she might be keeping underneath it. Halloran found the full shape of Tiffany's debt within a week. He reviewed the Milton Bank's credit records at Lorraine's quiet request. 2 credit cards, the bridge loan, the $12,000 deposit on Summers Lake, a total exposure of $53,000 against an inheritance that, legally, did not exist in the form Tiffany had assumed it would. He didn't share all of it with Lorraine at once. He doled it out carefully, the way a doctor delivers bad news in a sequence designed not to overwhelm. She's not evil, Lorraine, he said, the day he told her the full total. She's scared. Scared people reach for whatever's closest, same as I told you before. Doesn't excuse what she's doing to you. But it does explain it. I know, Lorraine said. I raised a son who married a woman running from something. I just wish somebody had told either of them that running toward my house wasn't going to fix whatever they were running from. Halloran had no answer for that. He didn't try to invent one, which was, Lorraine had come to understand over 4 decades of knowing him, one of his finest qualities. The weeks that followed had a strange, doubled quality. Lorraine was living 2 lives at once. In one, she was a grieving widow, still setting out 2 coffee cups every morning, still dusting a shelf that now held 2 ledgers instead of 1. In the other, she was a woman quietly assembling a case, meeting Nagpal twice more, having Halloran pull bank records, learning the language of trusts and recorded deeds and probate deadlines, the way she'd once learned the language of hay futures and feed prices, because Walter had needed her to understand those too, back when understanding a thing was how you loved a person in this family. Tiffany, for her part, was not idle. She came by the house on a Saturday with a folder of her own, brisk, a little too bright, the way people are when they've rehearsed a conversation in the car on the way over. Derek trailed behind her, hands in his pockets, not meeting his mother's eyes. Lorraine, Tiffany said, setting the folder on the kitchen table. Lorraine had scrubbed clean of ledgers the moment she saw the car in the driveway. I want to talk to you, mother to mother, because I care about you. A pause, calibrated. Derek and I have both noticed you've seemed, foggy lately. Forgetting things, missing calls. And with everything you've been through, that's completely understandable. But we think it might be worth having Dr. Ellison take a look, just to be safe. Lorraine looked at her son. Derek, do you think I've been foggy? Derek shifted his weight. I mean, you didn't call me back for 2 days last week, Mum. I was at the bank, Lorraine said evenly, and the lawyer's office, both of which I imagine Tiffany could confirm, since she seems to have looked into a great many things about this house lately. Something flickered across Tiffany's face, there and gone. I'm just concerned, she said, a fraction too fast. We've talked to an attorney about just options. In case you need help managing things going forward. A conservatorship isn't a scary word, Lorraine. It's just a legal tool to make sure you're protected. There it was, laid on the table as plainly as a hand of cards. Lorraine felt the old instinct rise in her. The instinct to smooth things over, to say something gentle so the room could stop feeling sharp. She let it pass through her instead of out of her. The way Walter used to let a bad season pass through him without breaking anything. I appreciate the concern, Lorraine said, in a voice so calm it seemed to surprise even Derek. I don't need a conservatorship. I need everyone in this family to wait 6 weeks for the probate hearing, same as the law requires, and let it settle the way it's going to settle. That's exactly the kind of thing I mean, Tiffany said, turning to Derek as if for a witness. She's talking about lawyers and hearings like she's running some kind of case. That's not like her, Derek. It's exactly like her, Derek said, quiet. For a moment, something in his face looked almost like the boy he'd been before Tiffany. Before the golf club wedding. Before embarrassed became the word Lorraine reached for when she thought of her own son. Mum's always been sharper than anybody gives her credit for. Dad used to say she kept the real books, whatever that meant. Tiffany's mouth tightened. Derek. I'm just saying, Derek said, and didn't finish saying it. Lorraine watched something small shift in the room. A hairline crack in a wall she'd assumed was solid. They left without the conservatorship conversation going anywhere. Though Lorraine understood, watching Tiffany's car pull out of the driveway too fast, gravel spitting from the tyres, that this was not over. Only paused. A hollow business, she thought, going after somebody's competence when what you actually want is their house. Halloran had been right. A debt with nothing behind it makes a person desperate. Desperate people reach for whatever's closest, even if what's closest is calling your husband's mother foggy in her own kitchen. She called Nagpal that evening. They mentioned a conservatorship, she said. Nagpal was quiet a beat. Did they file anything? Not yet. Tiffany said they'd talked to an attorney about options. Lorraine, I want you to hear this clearly. A conservatorship claim requires a medical evaluation and a judge's order. It is not something a daughter-in-law can simply decide to impose because she's in a hurry to sell a house. If anything, threatening it this close to a probate hearing looks less like concern for you. It looks more like pressure. A pause. I'd like to document this conversation if you're comfortable with that. Dates, what was said, who was present. I'm comfortable with that, Lorraine said. She hung up and sat at the table a long while, looking at the shelf where the two ledgers sat, dusted, waiting. Outside the last of the tobacco fields Walter had worked for 50 years lay fallow under a grey sky. Somewhere down the gravel road a dog barked twice and went quiet, same as it had the night she found the key. Edith came by again 2 days later, this time without a casserole. Just herself and a folding lawn chair she set up on Lorraine's porch, like she intended to stay a while. Heard Tiffany's been running her mouth about conservatorships at the fill-up, Edith said, meaning the gas station where half the county's gossip changed hands over coffee. Old Mrs. Beeler told me, said Tiffany told the cashier you'd gotten confused about the house paperwork. Lorraine felt something cold settle in her chest, followed almost immediately by something else, something steadier. She's telling people I'm confused, Lorraine repeated. At the gas station, in front of God and everybody. Edith's mouth was a thin, unimpressed line. You want my advice, and I know you didn't ask for it, but you want my advice, you let that hearing come to you calm as still water. Let her keep talking herself into a hole in public. Judges notice that kind of thing. Whole towns notice that kind of thing. Lorraine thought of Walter, tapping the ledger's last column. Patient as stone. Count the rows, Laurie. I intend to, she said. I've gotten very good at waiting. 3 weeks out from the hearing, a letter arrived from a law office in Charleston, addressed to Derek and Carol both, care of the Pruitt address, though it had been forwarded to Lorraine since she was the only one still living there. She almost didn't open it, since it wasn't hers by name. Then she saw the return address match the anonymous lawyer Halloran had mentioned, the one who'd quietly paid off the Hendersons' note back in '92. Her curiosity, old and stubborn as her husband's, got the better of her. Inside was a short letter. It notified the estate's heirs of a trust. Walter Pruitt had established it in 2009, funded with agricultural savings bonds, structured to distribute upon his death. it would release its first disbursement pending confirmation of the estate's settlement. The trust's sole listed beneficiary, the letter stated plainly, was Lorraine Ann Pruitt. Lorraine read it 3 times at the kitchen table, under the same lamp she'd read the second ledger by weeks before. A trust. A second one, separate from the deed, separate from the bonds in the safe deposit box. Halloran hadn't known about this one, because Walter, it seemed, had spread his patience across more than one institution, more than one quiet promise, in more than one direction, as though he'd built not just one lock but several, each with its own key, each one opening only when the time was finally right. She called Nagpal first thing in the morning. "There's a trust," she said. "I don't think even Halloran knew about this one." "Bring it in," Nagpal said. Lorraine could hear, even over the phone, the sound of a woman recalculating a case that had just gotten a great deal stronger. Sitting alone at her kitchen table, a lamp burning, a dead man's letter in her hands, Lorraine understood something new. Walter Pruitt hadn't left her one ledger and one secret. He'd left her an entire architecture of care, built slowly, silently, over decades, the way a man builds a barn to outlast the family that raised it, board by board, so that no single storm, no single greedy season could ever take it all at once. There was one more tier to the cavity. Lorraine didn't find it right away. It was Halloran, 3 weeks before the hearing, who noticed the small detail everyone else had missed. He'd been rereading the trust documents from the Charleston attorney's office, cross-checking dates against his own bank records, out of the same careful habit that had made him a good loan officer for 40 years. He found a line item that didn't match anything Lorraine had already seen. "Lorraine," he said, calling her at home. His voice carried the particular caution of a man about to hand over something he wasn't sure how to hand over gently. "There's a second name on this trust, not as a beneficiary. As a co-settler, somebody helped Walter fund this thing, put money in alongside his own every year, going back to 2001. Lorraine sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "Who?" "A woman named Ruth Ellen Voss," Halloran said. "Charleston address. I don't recognise the name, and I've known your husband 40 years. Lorraine turned the name over in her mind. She found nothing there, no memory, no face, no story Walter had ever told her that would explain a stranger from Charleston quietly co-funding a trust with her husband for over 2 decades. For one cold, disorienting moment, it felt like the ground under everything she'd learned in the last several weeks had shifted again. Not in a direction she'd expected or wanted. "I need to know who that is," she said, "before the hearing. I can't walk into that courtroom not knowing." She called Nagpal, who made a few careful calls of her own. By the next afternoon, they had an answer, delivered gently, the way Nagpal delivered most things that might land hard. Ruth Ellen Voss had been Walter's cousin, once removed, on his mother's side. A relation so distant Lorraine had genuinely never heard the name in 49 years of marriage. She'd married into money in Charleston in the 1970s. Widowed young herself, she'd spent decades quietly managing her late husband's investment firm. The same firm, it turned out, that had handled the anonymous payoff of the Henderson's note back in 1992. Walter didn't do all of this alone, Nagpal told Lorraine over the phone. There was something almost like wonder in her usually measured voice. He had a partner in it, a relative most of the family never even knew existed. Together the two of them spent over 2 decades quietly funding this trust, using it exactly the way your husband described to Tom Henderson, helping people in this county who needed help and would never have accepted it if they'd known where it came from. Lorraine sat with that a long time after the call ended, looking at the 2 ledgers on the shelf, understanding now that even the story she'd thought she'd finally uncovered in full had one more room in it she hadn't yet walked into. She thought about Walter's occasional weekend trips to Charleston over the years, always described vaguely as business, always brief, always followed by him coming home a little quieter than usual, a little more thoughtful. She understood now what those trips had actually been. She called the number Nagpal had found for Ruth Ellen Voss 2 days later. Her hands weren't quite steady on the phone. A warm, careful voice answered on the 3rd ring. "Mrs. Pruitt," Ruth Ellen said, before Lorraine had even finished introducing herself, as though she'd been half expecting this call for years, maybe decades. "I wondered if this day would come. I'm so very sorry about Walter. He was the finest man I ever knew, and I include my own late husband in that accounting, which he would have found extremely funny." I didn't know you existed until 2 days ago, Lorraine said. Honestly, because honesty seemed like the only appropriate currency for a conversation like this one. I know, Ruth Ellen said gently. That was by design. Mostly Walter's design. Though I went along with it because I understood his reasons. He didn't want you burdened with the details of where the money came from or who else was involved. Only that it would be there when you needed it. Clean and simple, and entirely yours to use as you saw fit. He used to say a gift with too many strings attached stops being a gift and starts being an obligation. He didn't want that for you. Not ever. Why did you help him? Lorraine asked. All these years. What was in it for you? Ruth Ellen was quiet a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had gone softer, older sounding, carrying decades of something Lorraine hadn't expected to hear in a stranger's voice over the phone. My husband left me more money than any one person could ever spend wisely alone, Mrs. Pruitt. Walter reached out to me not long after his mother, my aunt, passed, back in the 90s, just to ask how I was getting on. Nobody else in that side of the family had bothered in years. We got to talking about what a person does with more than they need. Somewhere in that conversation, we decided to do something quiet and useful with it together, instead of separately. It gave my money a purpose it hadn't had in a long while. I have him to thank for that, honestly. More than he ever had reason to thank me. Lorraine felt something loosen further in her chest, some last knot of confusion finally coming undone. Will the trust continue? She asked, now that he's gone. That's entirely up to you, Ruth Ellen said. I'll keep funding my half of it as long as I'm able. And gladly, if you'd like to keep it going. Or if you'd rather close it out and simply take what's yours. I understand that too, and I won't think less of you for it. It was always meant to serve you first, Mrs. Pruitt. Everything else was simply what your husband did with the parts he didn't need. Lorraine thought about the Pruitt provision. Not yet named, not yet even fully imagined at that point. Still just a half-formed idea sitting somewhere in the back of her mind since her visit with Tom Henderson. She thought about 30 years of quiet mercy, entered in ledgers nobody else had ever been meant to read. She understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, exactly what she wanted to do with what remained of it. I'd like to keep it going, she said, if you're willing. I was hoping you'd say that, Ruth Ellen said. Real warmth in it now. Unmistakable. The warmth of two strangers discovering, mid-conversation, that they had loved the very same quiet, remarkable man in two entirely different corners of his life. Somehow, without either of them planning it, they had ended up carrying the same weight forward together. They talked another 20 minutes. About Walter, about the trust, about small practical matters that would need sorting, once the hearing confirmed everything formally. By the time Lorraine hung up, she understood that her husband had left her something even larger than a deed or a trust, or $480,000. He'd left her a whole quiet network of decency she'd never known existed, stretching from a feed store in Linden Hollow to an investment office in Charleston, all of it running on the same patient current he'd kept flowing his entire life, without once needing to be seen doing it. She told Nagpal about Ruth Ellen the next morning. Nagpal, reviewing the new information, allowed herself something rare for a working attorney 3 days before a hearing. A genuine, delighted laugh. Lorraine, she said, I have handled a great many estate matters in this county. I can tell you honestly, I have never once had a case get better and better every single week the way yours has. Most families' secrets get uglier the deeper you dig. Yours just keeps getting kinder. That was Walter, Lorraine said simply. He was like that clear through, all the way to the bottom. I just hadn't finished digging yet. There was a stretch of days somewhere in the middle of those 6 weeks when Lorraine thought she might lose her nerve entirely. It happened on a Wednesday, grey and drizzling, the kind of day that made the whole valley look like it was underwater. She'd driven into town for groceries, a small errand, nothing more. She found herself standing in the cereal aisle at the fill-up, unable to remember what she'd come in for. Not because her mind had failed her, because she'd overheard, 2 aisles over, a conversation between two women she vaguely recognised from church, their voices pitched low, but not low enough. Heard she put the ledger back on some shelf like it's a Bible, one of them said. Sad, really. Grief does strange things to a person that age. Tiffany says she's been calling lawyers. At her age? Well, somebody's got to look out for her, I suppose. Lorraine stood very still behind the cereal boxes, holding a can of green beans she didn't need. The old shame rose in her chest, the shame of being talked about like she was already gone, like grief and age had made her a thing to be managed, rather than a woman still fully present in her own life. She almost put the green beans down and walked out without buying anything at all. Instead, she made herself walk to the end of the aisle, turn the corner, set the can down calmly in her cart, right in front of both women, who went abruptly, guiltily silent. "Afternoon, Marlene." "Afternoon, Pat," Lorraine said, pleasant as church, and pushed her cart on toward the dairy case, her spine straight as a fence post, her hands only shaking a little, only after she'd turned the corner where they couldn't see. That night she called Edith, something she rarely did. She preferred to let Edith come to her in her own time. But that night she needed to hear another voice say the thing out loud. "They're talking about me at the fill-up like I'm already in a home," Lorraine said. "Let them talk," Edith said immediately, no hesitation at all. "Lorraine Pruitt, I have known you 40 years. I watched you run this whole household, half the church rummage sale, and every hospital shift your husband ever needed covered, without breaking a sweat or raising your voice. You are the last woman in this county anybody ought to be worried about managing. It's Tiffany's guilt talking through other people's mouths, that's all it is. Guilty people always need an audience." "I know that," Lorraine said. "Knowing it and feeling it aren't the same thing. Some days." "No," Edith agreed. "They surely aren't." A pause, softer. "You want me to come sit with you a while?" "I'd like that," Lorraine said. She meant it more than she'd meant almost anything since the funeral. Edith came within the hour, folding chair and all, though this time she set it up inside, at the kitchen table across from Lorraine. The two of them sat together in the lamplight without talking much at all, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind Lorraine hadn't realised she'd been starving for since Walter died. Somewhere around 9, Edith reached across the table and tapped the cover of the second ledger, the one that said, "For the one who stayed." "You know what I think?" Edith said. "I think Walter Pruitt knew exactly what kind of woman he married. I think that's why he trusted you with the last column and not a single other living soul. Not even Halloran. Not all the way. He didn't leave you a treasure hunt because he doubted you could handle it, Lorraine. He left you one because he knew you could." Lorraine looked at the ledger a long while. "I used to think the quietest thing about our marriage was the thing that made it small," she said. "Two people who didn't talk much, didn't need much, didn't ask for much. I'm starting to think it was the biggest thing about it. All that quiet was just him, being careful, for 50 years, so that when this exact moment came, I'd have everything I needed. I wouldn't even have to raise my voice to prove it." "That's about the size of it," Edith said. The days after that steadied somehow, in a way Lorraine hadn't expected. She stopped flinching at the whispers. Or rather, she let them wash past her, the way weather washes past a fence post, present but not determining. She spent an afternoon with Nagpal reviewing exactly how the hearing would proceed. What documents would be entered, in what order. Nagpal watched her take careful notes in a small spiral notebook, not unlike the ones Walter used to keep in his shirt pocket. She said something that stayed with Lorraine for days afterward. "You know," Nagpal said, "most of my clients in these estate disputes come in furious. Understandably, somebody's tried to take something from them and they want blood. You've never once asked me to make anybody pay for what they've done. You've only asked me to make sure the truth gets said out loud in the right room at the right time." "That's all I ever wanted," Lorraine said. "Walter spent his whole life keeping accurate books. Seems only right I finish the job the same way." There was a second visit from Derek, alone this time. Tiffany not with him. Lorraine noted that before he'd even gotten out of the truck, he stood on the porch a long moment before knocking, the way a man stands outside a door when he isn't sure what he'll find on the other side of it, or maybe isn't sure what he'll find in himself once he's through it. "Mum," he said, once she'd let him in, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. I've always been honest with you, Derek." He sat at the kitchen table, in the chair that had been his as a boy, and looked at his hands for a long moment. "Did Dad leave you more than the house?" Tiffany's been saying things, about lawyers, about a trust. Lorraine studied her son's face, looking for the shape of Tiffany's ambition in it, finding instead mostly exhaustion, and underneath the exhaustion, something that might have been shame, or might have been the beginning of it. "Your father left me exactly what he intended to leave me," she said carefully. "You'll hear all of it in 6 days, in the courtroom, same as everyone else." because that's how the law works, and I intend to follow it to the letter. I'm not hiding anything from you, Derek. I'm just not handing it to you early, so it can be spent before it's even confirmed." Derek flinched at that, visibly. Lorraine understood she'd landed closer to a truth than she'd intended. "The Lake House deposit," he said quietly. "That was already spent, wasn't it? Before any of this." "I don't know the details of your finances, Derek. I know what Halloran told me about a credit application at the Milton Bank 3 weeks before your father passed." She kept her voice even, without cruelty. "The way you deliver a diagnosis rather than an accusation. I know your wife has been telling people at the fill-up that I've gotten confused about paperwork. I know she showed strangers through this house, your father's house, before probate had even started. I'm not asking you to choose between us, Derek. I'm asking you to open your eyes and see what's actually happening in your own home. Because I don't think you have been." Derek sat with that for a long time, the kitchen clock ticking, the same clock that had ticked through his entire childhood. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet in a way Lorraine hadn't seen since he was young enough to still cry openly in front of his mother. "I've been a coward," he said. "About a lot of things. I let her talk about you that way because it was easier than fighting about it. I told myself I was keeping the peace." "There's a difference," Lorraine said gently, "between keeping the peace and letting somebody bury it under your own roof." He didn't say anything to that, only nodded, and stayed another hour, mostly quiet. When he left, he hugged her at the door, longer than he had in years. Lorraine stood on the porch watching his taillights disappear down the gravel road. She felt, for the first time in this whole long ordeal, something that might have been the very beginning of hope for her son, separate from anything Walter had left in any ledger. 4 days before the hearing, Lorraine drove out to see Tom Henderson. She hadn't planned to. She'd meant only to ask Halloran for the man's number, so she could confirm, quietly, the shape of what her husband had done in 1992. But somewhere between the bank and home, she found herself turning the truck down the old feed store road instead, the one that hadn't seen a feed delivery in 15 years, toward the small brick house Tom Henderson had lived in, since before Lorraine was even married. He was 81 now, thin, with a cane, and a good memory. He answered the door in his undershirt. He had the particular, unhurried courtesy of a man who had all the time in the world. Decades ago he'd learned not to waste any of it being rude. "Lorraine Pruitt," he said, surprised, pleased. "Come in out of that wind. Haven't seen you since Walter's funeral." His front room smelled like coffee and old newspapers. He settled her into a chair by the window, with the ease of a man who had done this exact hospitality 1,000 times, over 60 years in this county. Lorraine didn't waste his patience with small talk longer than the occasion required. "Tom," she said, "I need to ask you something about 1992, the feed store and the bank, and a note that got paid off by a lawyer in Charleston nobody ever named." Something shifted in the old man's face, a door opening slowly on a room he hadn't walked into in a long while. "You know," he said, "in 30-some years you're the first person who's ever come and asked me straight out. Everybody in this town's guessed and gossiped, but nobody's ever just asked." "I'm asking," Lorraine said. "Was it Walter?" Tom Henderson was quiet a long moment. He looked out the window at the same fallow fields Lorraine could see from her own porch, 3 miles distant, cut from the same grey autumn cloth. "The bank was 2 weeks from taking the store," he said finally. "I had 4 kids, one of them sick, hospital bills stacked higher than the mortgage itself. I remember standing in that bank lobby, certain I was about to lose the only thing my father ever built. A letter showed up at the house not 4 days later, from a Charleston law office I'd never heard of. Said the note was paid in full. Anonymous benefactor. No further obligation." He shook his head slowly. "I asked around for years. Nobody in this county had that kind of money to just give away quiet as a Sunday prayer. Except, I guess, somebody did." "He never told me," Lorraine said. 50 years married, and he never once told me." "That sounds exactly like Walter Pruitt," Tom said. "Real warmth in it. The warmth of a man remembering a friend he'd never properly gotten to thank. He came by the store back before it closed. Must have been 91, 92, right around when all this happened. Bought 40 pounds of feed he didn't need. Stood around talking about the weather for 20 minutes, like a man who had all day, which Walter never did, being a farmer. I always thought that was strange. Now I think he was checking on us, making sure we were still standing, before he decided we were worth saving. Lorraine felt something thick rise in her throat. I wish he told me, she said again, quieter this time. Maybe he figured a secret like that isn't really a gift if you're standing around waiting to be thanked for it, Tom said gently. Man who saves somebody's home anonymous, he's not doing it for the thank you. He's doing it because it's the right thing, and he can afford to do it without anybody owing him anything back. That's a rare kind of decent, Lorraine. Rarer than money. She drove home slower than usual, the truck's heater ticking against the cold, thinking about a man who had spent 30 years quietly saving strangers, who had never once let his own wife in on the secret. Not because he didn't trust her, she understood now, because that was simply the shape of his love. Patient, unannounced, entered in a ledger only he could fully read, until the day came when somebody else finally needed to. She thought too about what this meant for tomorrow. Nagpal had been careful to keep the hearing narrowly focused on the deed and the trust, the legal facts a judge could act on. But Lorraine found herself wanting, badly, for the room to understand the whole of what Walter Pruitt had actually been. Not merely a farmer with a hidden nest egg, a man who had spent half a lifetime quietly propping up a county that mostly assumed nothing much of him at all. That evening Carol arrived from the airport, tired from the flight and the drive up from Charleston, but bright-eyed in a way that reminded Lorraine sharply of Walter, his own quiet intensity when something mattered to him. She hugged her mother hard in the driveway, under a sky gone the colour of a healing bruise, purple and orange at the edges. Derek called me, Carol said, once they were inside, coats off, a fresh pot of coffee between them at the kitchen table. Said he's been thinking about things. Said he told Tiffany he wasn't going to sit there tomorrow and let her call you confused in front of a judge. Lorraine looked up, surprised. He said that? He said it, and from the sound of his voice, I think for the first time in about 9 years he actually meant something he said to that woman. Carol wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. I don't know if it's enough, Mum. I don't know if he's really changed, or if he's just scared of how this is going to look tomorrow. But it's something. It's something, Lorraine agreed. She thought of the crack she'd noticed in her son's face weeks ago, at the kitchen table, when he'd said Mom's always been sharper than anybody gives her credit for. A crack was not a door, but a crack was where light eventually found its way in, if you were patient enough to wait for it. Lorraine had spent 49 years married to the most patient man in Linden Hollow. She supposed some of it had rubbed off. She showed Carol both ledgers that night, laid out on the kitchen table under the lamp. She watched her daughter's face move through the same slow astonishment Lorraine herself had felt weeks before, tracing the small entries with one finger, $25 here, $50 there. Fortimer. 3 decades of quiet accumulation, adding up to something neither of Walter's own children had ever imagined their father capable of. He was really something, wasn't he? Carol said softly, closing the second ledger with the reverence of someone closing a family Bible. And none of us ever really saw it. We just saw an old farmer who wouldn't buy a new truck. That's the thing about your father, Lorraine said. He never once needed anybody to see it. That was the whole point. They sat together a while longer, mother and daughter, the coffee going cold between them, the way Walter's coffee had gone cold every morning for 6 weeks. Outside, the wind picked up off the ridge, rattling the old porch swing that wasn't there anymore, carried off by a woman who had never once bothered to ask what she was really taking. 5 days before the hearing, a locksmith's van pulled into Lorraine's driveway unannounced. She watched it from the kitchen window. A young man in a grey uniform climbed out with a work order clipboard. A cold, clear certainty settled over her before he'd even reached the porch steps. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, checking his clipboard. "I've got a work order here for a lock recce at this address. Paid for by a Tiffany Pruitt." "Is that so?" Lorraine said, and did not invite him in. "Says here the homeowner requested new locks ahead of an upcoming property sale. Standard prep, ma'am, nothing unusual." He glanced up, a little uncertain now, sensing something in her stillness that his work order hadn't prepared him for. "You are Mrs. Pruitt, correct?" "I am Mrs. Pruitt," Lorraine said. "I am also the sole owner of this property. A fact you're welcome to verify at the county recorder's office before you touch a single lock on this house. I'd suggest you call whoever dispatched you and confirm the paperwork before you do anything at all." The young man looked back down at his clipboard, then back up at her, then made the call right there on the porch, speaking in low, apologetic tones to someone on the other end, presumably a dispatcher, presumably Tiffany herself. Lorraine stood in her doorway, arms folded, patient as a fence post in weather. She watched the young man's face shift from confusion to something like professional relief as he ended the call. "Mom, I'm sorry for the trouble," he said. "Seems there was some confusion on the paperwork. I won't be doing any work here today." "No trouble at all," Lorraine said, and meant it mostly, though her hands were shaking faintly by the time she closed the door behind him. The particular tremor of a woman who has just watched, in real time, exactly how far another person was willing to go. She called Nagpal immediately. She sent a locksmith to rekey the house, Lorraine said, 5 days before the hearing. There was a brief, sharp silence on the line, the sound of a lawyer recalibrating a strategy in real time. "That's attempted interference with property she has no legal claim to," Nagpal said finally. "And it's 5 days before a hearing where that exact claim's going to be decided. Lorraine, I want you to write down everything. The time, the locksmith's name if you got it, the company, word for word what he said. This is exactly the kind of pattern that makes a judge's decision easy instead of close." "I have his card," Lorraine said. "He left it on the porch table, apologizing." "Good. Keep it safe." A pause. "I know this is exhausting. I know every week of this has probably felt like 6. But you are one hearing away from this being entirely, permanently over. Every mistake she makes between now and then only makes that hearing shorter." Lorraine sat at the kitchen table after the call, the locksmith's business card in front of her, next to both ledgers. She felt for the first time in the whole ordeal something closer to anger than grief. Not loud anger, not the kind that needed to be shouted from a porch. A quiet, settled anger. The kind Walter used to get when a neighbour's fence wandered a few feet onto Pruitt land. He'd simply, patiently, without a single raised word, walk the property line with a surveyor, until the matter was settled beyond any further argument. She understood sitting there that she had spent 49 years believing quiet meant weak, watching her own gentleness get read by people like Tiffany as an invitation. She understood now that quiet had simply been waiting, the whole time, for the moment it would matter most, gathering itself the way a held breath gathers pressure before it's finally released. That evening she told Edith about the locksmith. For once, Edith didn't offer comfort first. She laughed, short and sharp, without much humour in it. "Lord, that woman really cannot help herself, can she? Sending a stranger to change your locks 5 days before a judge decides whose house it is. That's not desperation anymore, Lorraine. That's a woman handing the prosecution her own confession. Gift wrapped." Nagpal said something similar. Nagpal's right. Edith reached over and squeezed her hand. "You just keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Nothing. Let her keep proving your case for you." The night before the hearing, Derek called one final time. His voice low, careful, sounding older than Lorraine had heard him sound in years. "Mom," he said, "I heard about the locksmith. I want you to know I had no idea. I would never have agreed to that." "I believe you," Lorraine said, and found that she did. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, "about what you said, about keeping the peace versus letting somebody bury it under your own roof." A long pause, the sound of a man working up to something that cost him. "I'm going to tell the truth tomorrow, Mum. Whatever she says, whatever it cost at home. I should have done it weeks ago." Lorraine closed her eyes, standing in her kitchen with the phone against her ear, the 2 ledgers on the shelf behind her. She felt something in her chest that was not quite forgiveness yet, but was perhaps its patient and necessary beginning. "Your father would be glad to hear you say that," she said. "So am I." The morning of the hearing broke clear and cold, the first real frost of the season silvering the fallow tobacco rows. Lorraine stood at her kitchen window a long while before Carol came downstairs. She watched the light change over land Walter had worked for 50 years. Land he had, it seemed, quietly ensured would never leave her hands. She dressed carefully. Not for vanity. She understood in some old instinctive way that how a woman carried herself into a room mattered almost as much as what she carried in her file folder. She chose the forest teal cardigan, the one Walter always said matched her eyes, over a plain grey dress. She pinned her hair the way she'd worn it every Sunday for 30 years. She looked, she thought, catching her reflection in the hallway mirror beside the shelf where the 2 ledgers sat, like exactly what she was. an ordinary woman who had spent a lifetime being underestimated, about to walk into a room and be seen clearly for the first time in longer than she could remember. "You ready?" Carol asked, appearing at the bottom of the stairs in a dark blazer, looking so much like Walter in that moment. The same set jaw, the same steady eyes that Lorraine's breath caught for half a second. "I've been ready for 6 weeks," Lorraine said. They drove down the mountain together, the radio off, comfortable in the kind of silence only family can share. Lorraine found herself thinking not about Tiffany, not about the hearing, but about a Tuesday 40 years ago. Walter had come in from the fields covered in dust. He sat down at this same kitchen table and told her, apropos of nothing, that he intended for them to never owe a single soul in this county, nothing they couldn't repay twice over. She hadn't understood, at the time, that he meant it as a life's mission rather than a passing remark. She understood it now. Halloran met them in the courthouse parking lot, dressed in a suit that looked like it had last been worn at somebody's funeral, which, Lorraine suspected, it probably had. "You holding up all right?" he asked, offering her his arm across the icy pavement, an old-fashioned courtesy she accepted without argument. "Better than I expected to be," Lorraine said. "You didn't have to come, Halloran. 36 years I kept that box sealed and never said a word to a soul," he said. "Feels wrong not to see how the story ends after all that quiet." Inside, Nagpal was already waiting near the courtroom doors, her folder organised with the precision of a surgeon's tray. She walked them through the sequence one final time, in low, careful tones. The deed first, then the pattern of pressure, then the trust. Each piece landing exactly where it would do the most good. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. "Whatever happens in there," Nagpal said, meeting Lorraine's eyes directly, "you've already won the part that matters most. You found the truth, you documented it, and you did it without ever once raising your voice or lowering yourself to their level. The judge is just going to make it official." Lorraine thought of Walter tapping the ledger's last column, patient as stone. She thought of Edith on the porch the evening before, telling her to pour herself a metaphorical coffee and let the storm pass. She thought of Tom Henderson, 81 years old, finally getting to say out loud the debt of gratitude he'd carried unspoken for 30 years. She thought of the note in her mailbox, unsigned, "We don't forget." Walking through those heavy courthouse doors, with her daughter on one side and a loyal old banker on the other, she understood she was not walking in alone. Perhaps she had never truly been alone at all, not once, not even in the 11 loneliest days of her life. The courtroom smelled like every courthouse Lorraine had ever set foot in, floor wax and old paper, and a heating system that ran too hot for October. Derek was already seated near the front, alone, his hands clasped between his knees like a boy waiting outside a principal's office. Something in the set of his shoulders looked different than it had 6 weeks ago, less certain of his own righteousness, more braced for whatever was coming. Tiffany arrived 4 minutes later, brisk heels on old wood floors, a leather folder under one arm, the same brand of confidence she'd worn, wrapping silver in Lorraine's dish towels 6 weeks before. Though Lorraine noticed, watching her settle into the seat beside Derek, that the confidence looked thinner this morning, stretched over something underneath that had started, finally, to show through. Judge Marsh was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back tight, a manner that suggested she had heard every version of family greed the county had to offer and was no longer surprised by any of them. She called the Pruitt estate matter third on the docket. The whole small courtroom seemed to inhale at once, the way a room does right before something in it finally, irreversibly, changes. The probate courtroom was smaller than Lorraine had expected. Wood-panelled, a judge's bench up front, a scattering of folding chairs for the handful of people with business there that morning. She took her seat beside Carol. In the second row, Halloran settling in just behind them. Across the aisle, Tiffany sat beside Derek without acknowledging Lorraine at all, which Lorraine found, oddly, easier to bear than a fight would have been. Nagpal rose smoothly, professionally, a folder of her own tucked under one arm. "Your Honour," Nagpal said, "before the court proceeds to the general estate matters on today's docket, I need to bring forward a threshold issue regarding the primary real property at the centre of this case, namely the Pruitt family home and its surrounding 40 acres. "Go ahead, counsel," Judge Marsh said. "The home has been listed among the assets pending distribution in this probate matter," Nagpal said. "However, county records show that the deed to this property, along with its associated mineral rights, was recorded 11 years ago. in 2015, in the sole name of Lorraine Ann Pruitt. Not the decedent Walter Pruitt. Not any other heir. Mrs. Pruitt solely. She stepped forward and set a certified copy of the deed on the clerk's desk. This property was never part of Mr. Pruitt's estate to begin with. It cannot be sold, listed, or distributed through this proceeding. The courtroom's small murmur of ordinary business noise stopped entirely. Tiffany's head came up sharply. "That can't be right," she said, loud enough to carry, forgetting for a moment the courtroom decorum she'd otherwise performed so carefully. "We had a realtor lined up. We had a closing date. Mrs. Pruitt," Judge Marsh said. Not unkindly, but with the flat finality of a woman who had said this sentence many times before. If you had a closing date scheduled for a property you did not have clear legal authority to sell, that is a matter for you and your realtor, not for this court. Derek's face had gone pale. He leaned toward Tiffany and said something low that Lorraine couldn't hear. Tiffany's jaw tightened, the muscle working visibly under her carefully applied makeup. "Your Honour," Nagpal continued, "I'd also like the court to note, for the record, a pattern of conduct that bears on the credibility of certain claims made against Mrs. Pruitt in recent weeks." She laid a second document on the clerk's desk. 3 weeks ago, a discussion arose within the family regarding a possible conservatorship petition against Mrs. Pruitt, on the stated basis that she had become, quote, "foggy and forgetful." I have documented correspondence and a witness statement confirming this conversation took place. I would note that at the same time these concerns were being raised, Mrs. Pruitt was independently meeting with counsel, coordinating with a licensed bank officer, and assembling exactly the kind of clear, organised documentation now before this court. I would submit, respectfully, that a woman capable of doing that is not a woman in need of a conservator. A small startled sound came from somewhere near the back of the courtroom. A woman Lorraine didn't recognise, maybe a clerk, maybe just someone waiting on the next case. Lorraine felt for the first time in 6 weeks something close to lightness. "Your Honour," Tiffany said, standing now, her voice climbing towards something less controlled than she likely intended. "I don't know what she's implying, but Lorraine has clearly been under a great deal of stress, and frankly this is a family that has always kept things from each other. So I don't see why, Mrs. Pruitt," Judge Marsh said, and this time there was iron in it. "You will have an opportunity to address the court, but you will do so when I recognise you, and you will not speak over opposing counsel again in my courtroom." Tiffany sat, 2 spots of colour high on her cheeks. Nagpal continued, calm as still water, exactly the way Edith had counselled Lorraine to be 6 weeks ago, on a porch with a folding lawn chair. "There is one further matter, Your Honour, which I raise not to prolong this proceeding, but because I believe the court and this family deserve the full picture." She turned to a third document. In addition to the deed, Mr. Pruitt established a private trust in 2009, funded incrementally over 3 decades through the purchase of small denomination savings bonds, recorded and verifiable through the issuing institution. The trust's sole listed beneficiary is Lorraine Ann Pruitt. Its current value, confirmed by the trust's administering attorney, as of this week is $480,000. Now, the number landed in the courtroom the way a stone lands in still water. A small sound followed by a much larger ripple. Derek's mouth opened slightly. Tiffany went very still. The particular stillness of a person doing fast, silent arithmetic against a number that had just made every other number in her life smaller. $480,000, Judge Marsh repeated, glancing down at the paperwork Nagpal had submitted, held entirely outside the estate, entirely outside probate, in a trust established over a decade before Mr. Pruitt's death. "Yes, Your Honour," Nagpal said. Judge Marsh looked over her glasses, first at the paperwork, then at Lorraine, sitting quietly in the second row, in her forest teal cardigan, with her hands folded in her lap, the same posture she'd have used sitting through a long church service. Patient, upright, unhurried. "Mrs. Pruitt," the judge said, "it appears your late husband was a remarkably careful man." "He kept good books, Your Honour," Lorraine said. It was the first thing she'd said aloud in the courtroom, and her voice didn't shake at all. 50 years of them. Some people called it clutter. I called it love, written down where nobody thought to look. Something in Judge Marsh's expression softened. Just slightly, just for a moment. The crack in a professional face that comes when a courtroom accidentally produces something true. The court finds, Judge Marsh said, turning back to her notes, that the real property at issue, along with the associated trust, are excluded from the probate estate and confirmed as the sole property of Lorraine Ann Pruitt, effective as of their original recording and establishment dates. The remaining estate matters, farm equipment, vehicles, and general accounts, will proceed to distribution among the named heirs per the existing will. She looked up. Given the pattern of conduct raised today, I am also going to note for the record that any future attempt to pursue conservatorship proceedings against Mrs. Pruitt will require independent medical evaluation ordered by this court, not a private arrangement between family members. Is that understood by all parties? Understood, Your Honour, Nagpal said. Tiffany said nothing at all. Beside her, Derek had put his face in his hands. Not crying exactly, but close to it. The posture of a man realising all at once how much he had let happen simply by staying quiet in the passenger seat of his own marriage. Judge Marsh moved on to the docket's next matter, and just like that, it was over. The way most reckonings actually are. Quiet and procedural. Entered into a record that would sit in a filing cabinet for the next 100 years, mattering enormously to exactly the handful of people in that room, to no one else at all. The courtroom emptied slowly, the way courtrooms do after something has actually mattered inside them. People gathering coats and folders with the particular hush of witnesses to something they'll be telling their spouses about at dinner. Judge Marsh had already moved on to a zoning dispute 2 cases down the docket. Her gavel's small dry knock, the only sound marking the transition from Lorraine's whole life to someone else's ordinary Tuesday business. In the hallway outside, Tiffany stood alone for a moment, her leather folder clutched against her chest, staring at nothing in particular. Derek approached her slowly, said something low that Lorraine couldn't hear. Tiffany's face crumpled. Not into tears exactly, into the specific exhaustion of a person watching a story they'd told themselves for months collapse in a public hallway, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Lorraine didn't go to her. She had considered it in the days leading up to the hearing, whether some part of her owed Tiffany a private word once it was over, a softening, an old habit of smoothing rooms that still lived somewhere in her hands even now. But Nagpal had counselled otherwise, gently, and Edith more bluntly. In the end, Lorraine had decided the matter for herself, standing at her own kitchen window that morning. She would not chase forgiveness toward a woman who hadn't yet asked for it. She would simply be available for it someday, if it ever genuinely came. Halloran walked her to the truck instead, his arm offered again across the same icy pavement. At the door he paused, looking back at the courthouse with an expression Lorraine couldn't quite read. 36 years I kept that key box a secret, he said. Feels strange having it finally be over. You did right by him, Lorraine said. By both of us. Wasn't hard, Halloran said. Man asks you to keep a promise for 50 years, cash up front, no explanation. You learn pretty quick whether he's the kind of man worth keeping a promise for. Walter Pruitt was exactly that kind. He opened her truck door for her. You'll be all right now, Lorraine. I believe I will, she said and climbed in. The days that followed had a texture Lorraine hadn't felt in years. Maybe not since before Walter's diagnosis. A kind of ordinary peace she'd forgotten was even available to her. The deed was formally confirmed at the county recorder's office the following week. A 15-minute clerical matter that felt after 6 weeks of upheaval almost anticlimactically small. The way most true endings usually are. The trust's first disbursement arrived by certified letter 10 days after that. The number printed plainly on the page, $480,000. Less than the emotional weight of it by a mile. More than enough, practically, to never again worry about a roof or a winter or a hospital bill for the rest of her life. Tiffany's realtor listing was quietly withdrawn. The Summers Lake deposit was forfeited entirely. Lorraine learned this through Edith's endless network of gossip, which turned out, more often than not, to be simple, accurate information delivered without malice. The seller kept the $12,000 per the contract's terms since the buyer had failed to close. Grant Voss, the financial advisor who'd first floated the conservatorship strategy over an unmentioned lunch, stopped returning Tiffany's calls within a month. He'd apparently decided a client whose plan had unravelled this publicly in a county courtroom was no longer worth the professional risk. Derek came to see his mother alone, twice more, in the weeks after the hearing. The second visit, he brought a toolbox, unprompted, and spent an entire Saturday afternoon repairing the porch railing that had gone loose sometime over the summer. The kind of quiet, physical labour his father had always trusted more than words to say what needed saying. Lorraine brought him iced tea around mid-afternoon and stood watching him work. This grown man with his father's exact hands, tightening a bolt with the same unhurried patience Walter had once used to teach him. "I talked to a lawyer of my own," Derek said, not looking up from the railing. "About the marriage. Tiffany and I are, I think, going to separate. Not because of the money exactly. Because of what the money showed me about how she sees things. How she saw you." He finally met her eyes. "I should have seen it years ago, Mum. I'm sorry it took a courtroom to make me look. Some things a person can only see when they're finally ready to," Lorraine said. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not relieved. But it grieves me too, for both of you. Especially for the years you spent scared to disagree with somebody in your own house." "I'm working on that," Derek said, slowly. "Slowly is fine," Lorraine said. "Your father built a 40-acre farm one row at a time. Nobody in this family's ever been in the business of instant anything." He laughed at that. A real laugh, the first she'd heard from him since before the funeral. Something in her chest, some old worried knot she hadn't fully named even to herself, finally began to loosen. Carol flew back to Ohio 2 days after the hearing, but called every Sunday now, without fail. A habit that had started somewhere in the fear of those 6 weeks, and simply never stopped once the fear had passed. "Dad would be so proud of you, Mom," she said on one of those calls, her voice thick with something between laughter and tears. "I keep thinking about that ledger. 50 years of hay prices and feed bills, and buried right in the middle of all that boring bookkeeping was the biggest act of love I've ever heard of." "He was a strange, quiet, wonderful man," Lorraine said. "I don't think either of us ever fully knew the size of him while he was alive to see it." "Maybe that's the whole point of a man like that," Carol said. "He wasn't trying to be seen. He was trying to make sure the people he loved would be all right long after he wasn't around to be thanked for it." Lorraine thought about that for a long time after they hung up. She stood at her kitchen window in the late afternoon light, looking out at the tobacco fields. Come spring, someone would need to decide what to plant in them now that the man who'd worked them for 50 years was gone. She thought she might plant something new this year, something Walter had never gotten around to trying. Not out of stubbornness, but simply because a man farming 40 acres alone at 70 could only manage so many experiments in one lifetime. She had time now, money enough to not fear a bad season. And a whole county's worth of quiet gratitude she was only just beginning to understand the shape of. Tom Henderson came by one afternoon in November, driven by his granddaughter since his own eyesight had gotten too poor for the mountain roads. He sat with Lorraine on the porch a long while, both of them wrapped in blankets against the cold. They said very little. It was the comfortable silence of two people who'd known the same good man from two very different angles, and had finally, between them, assembled a fuller picture of him. "I want to do something," Tom said eventually. "For the county. In his name. Been thinking on it since I found out the trust's still active. Still funding things quiet the way it always has." "What kind of thing?" Lorraine asked. "The old feed store building's still standing, empty as it's been for 15 years. I've been meaning to do something with it for a decade and never had the money or the nerve. Thought maybe it could be a place. Food pantry maybe, or a spot for folks going through hard patches to get help without the whole town knowing their business. The way Walter always managed to help people without anybody knowing his." Lorraine sat with that a long moment, watching the light fall gold and low across the fields. "He'd like that," she said. "He always did believe the best kind of help was the kind nobody had to be thanked for out loud." "Would you want your name on it?" Tom asked. "Or his?" "His," Lorraine said without hesitation. "Call it the Pruitt Provision. Let it just be there, doing its quiet work the way he always did his." Tom smiled. The first real smile Lorraine had seen from him since she'd shown up on his porch, asking questions about 1992. "The Pruitt Provision," he said, trying the words out like a man fitting a key into a lock he already suspected would turn. "I think that's exactly right." Ruth Ellen Voss came to Linden Hollow that spring. Her first visit in over a decade, driven up from Charleston by a nephew, since she no longer trusted her own eyes on unfamiliar roads. She was smaller than Lorraine had pictured from the phone, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, dressed plainly despite the money Halloran's research had confirmed she still commanded. She stood a long moment on the Pruitt porch before knocking, looking at the freshly rebuilt swing, with an expression Lorraine couldn't quite name. "He wrote to me about this porch," Ruth Ellen said, when Lorraine opened the door. "More than once over the years. Said it was the one place in the world he never had to explain himself to anybody." "It still is," Lorraine said, and invited her in. They sat together at the kitchen table, where 2 ledgers had once lain open under a lamp. Ruth Ellen told her stories Lorraine had never heard. Walter, as a young man, visiting Charleston after his mother's funeral. Quiet and awkward and deeply serious about wanting to do something useful with whatever he eventually managed to save. She spoke of him with a fondness that carried no romance in it at all, only the plain durable respect of 2 people who had found, almost by accident, that they shared the same rare instinct for quiet usefulness. They had spent 30 years building something out of that shared instinct without either of them needing much credit for it. "He talked about you constantly," Ruth Ellen said. "Not in a sentimental way, in a practical way. What you'd need, what would make you comfortable, what would happen to the farm if he went first, which he always assumed he would, being older." She reached across the table and took Lorraine's hand, briefly. "The way you'd touch something fragile you respected too much to hold on to for long. He never once doubted you'd be all right, Mrs. Pruitt. He only wanted to make certain of it himself in advance, the way a careful man makes certain of everything." Lorraine walked her out to the fields before she left that afternoon, the 2 of them moving slowly along the fence line Walter had walked 10,000 times. Ruth Ellen paused at the edge of the property, looking out at the tobacco rows going green again after a long fallow winter. "He'd be glad you're planting something new," Ruth Ellen said. "I thought I might try soybeans," Lorraine said. "Something he never got around to." "He'd like that," Ruth Ellen said. "A little continuation and a little departure, both at once." That was rather his whole philosophy if you think about it. Keep what's solid, try what's new, never confuse the 2. They stood together a while longer in the spring light. 2 women who had loved the same quiet man from very different distances. When Ruth Ellen finally left that evening, driven back down the mountain by her patient nephew, Lorraine stood on the porch a long time afterward, watching the taillights disappear, feeling the particular fullness of a story that had finally, completely, run out of hidden rooms. There was nothing left to discover now. Only the ordinary, unhurried work of living the rest of her life inside what her husband had so carefully built for her. One quiet year at a time. Exactly the way he would have wanted it done. Winter came hard to Linden Hollow that year, the kind of cold that made the gravel road out to the Pruitt place freeze solid by December and stay that way clean through February. Lorraine found she didn't mind it the way she once might have. She had oil enough in the tank now to keep the whole house warm through the worst of it. A truck reliable enough to make the drive into town whenever she pleased. Neither of those things had anything at all to do with money for their own sake, only with the particular peace of no longer having to measure every small comfort against a fear of running short. She kept a small notebook now, in the drawer beneath the 2 ledgers, where she wrote down every small kindness that came her way that winter. A neighbour who ploughed her driveway without being asked. A church casserole left warm on the porch. Halloran stopping by just to check the furnace was holding. She didn't know exactly why she kept the notebook. Maybe it was Walter's habit, finally caught, after 49 years of watching him do the same, with numbers instead of names. She kept setting out 2 coffee cups most mornings, though somewhere around the new year she started, without quite deciding to, only pouring the second one on Sundays. A small private ritual instead of a daily ache. Grief finding its own slower rhythm, the way grief eventually does for anyone patient enough to let it. Tiffany moved out of the house she and Derek had shared in February, into an apartment on the other side of the county. Lorraine heard, through Edith, that she'd taken a job at the bank in Milton, the same one that had denied her credit application. An irony nobody in Linden Hollow seemed able to resist mentioning at least once. Lorraine felt hearing it something more complicated than satisfaction. A kind of tired hope, maybe, that a woman who had spent her whole life mistaking appearance for substance might finally learn the difference, in a small brick building doing honest work with real numbers. Derek came by most Sundays now, sometimes alone, sometimes with a woman named Patricia he'd started seeing in the spring, a schoolteacher from 2 towns over, who asked Lorraine real questions about Walter and actually waited to hear the answers. Which Lorraine had come to understand, slowly, was the rarest and most valuable thing a person could offer another person's grief. He'd finished the porch railing back in the fall and moved on that winter to rebuilding the swing Tiffany had carried off in a cardboard box, working from an old photograph Carol had found on her phone, matching the joints and the paint colour as close as memory and lumber would allow. He hung it on a clear morning in April, the first truly warm day of the year. Lorraine came out onto the porch to find him testing the chains with his full weight, the same way Walter used to test them every spring before the good weather came. "Looks just like his," she said. "Not quite," Derek said. "His had a rattle in the left chain. I couldn't figure out how to put that back." "Some things you don't have to rebuild," Lorraine said. "They just come back on their own, given enough time." The Pruitt provision opened its doors that same April. In the old feed store building, Tom Henderson had spent the winter fixing it up with volunteers from 3 different churches, and a county grant NAGPAL had helped them file for. It was a small, quiet operation, a pantry in back and a folding table up front. Anybody going through a hard patch could sit and talk to somebody, without the whole town needing to know their business. Lorraine cut the ribbon herself, at Tom's insistence, standing on the old feed store steps in her forest teal cardigan, while half of Linden Hollow looked on. "Some of you knew my husband as a quiet man who kept a farm, and kept to himself," she told the small crowd, her voice steady, carrying easily in the cold, clear air. "I knew him that way too, for 49 years. It took his death, and a ledger he left behind on purpose, to teach me the rest of what he actually was. He believed the truest kind of help was the kind that never asked to be thanked. I think the least we can do, now that we know, is finally say the thank you out loud. On his behalf, since he never once let any of us say it while he was here to hear it." There was a small, warm silence after that, the kind that settles over a crowd when something true has finally been spoken plainly. Then Edith, standing near the front in her good coat, started to clap, and the rest of the street followed. Lorraine stood there in the April sun, feeling, for the first time in a very long while, entirely and simply happy. She drove home alone that evening, the truck windows cracked to let in the first real warmth of spring. She pulled into the gravel drive just as the light was going long, and gold over the fallow fields. Her husband had worked them for 50 years and left them, in the end, entirely and legally to her. The porch swing hung still in the evening air, waiting. Lorraine climbed the steps and sat down in the swing. She let it rock, once, twice, the chains holding steady. No rattle yet.